want to hear a long, cool story about the development of Christianity?
Yeah, let's do it.
So, all right, this is going to take
How
me.
long?
It's going to take me like probably a few minutes to tell the story.
Let's do it.
All right.
Let's do it.
So, you have ancient Judaism as far back as the 3rd century BCE. And during this time period, there is Alexander the Great's generals are fighting with each other, trying to conquer the lands. They want to develop their own empires. And the Jews are sort of in the middle of all this. They're sort of being tossed around it's like a game of tug of rope. The Jews are the rope. They're tugging at these people. And the Ptolemies are down in Egypt. The Seleucids are in Babylon. And there's Macedonians in Greece. And the Romans are the new kid on the block. And they're starting to rise up. Around 200 BC, the Romans defeat the Carthaginians. They defeat Hannibal. And they start to expand their empire. Antiochus III, which is the Seleucid king around this time period, goes to war against the Romans. And they lose. And the winner of this war would take the naval dominance of the Mediterranean. So if Antiochus would have defeated the Romans, it would be the Greek Empire, not the Roman Empire, that would have controlled the world. But no, the Romans won this war against all odds. The Seleucids were probably the favored ones at the time period because they're the Macedonians. They're the power of the world. Anyways, long story short, the Romans win. They become the naval dominance of the Mediterranean. As a result of this, the Seleucids, who at the time were controlling Judea, were forced to give up, the sources say 2 million slaves, and to relocate them into these new occupied cities that the Romans just conquered in Greece, in Asia Minor. So Turkey and Greece were being populated with these 2 million Jewish slaves that were given up by the Seleucids to go and live in these cities and occupy them that the Romans now control. So as a result, you get millions of Jews being relocated into Greek cities where they're being introduced into the Greek way of life, but they're Jews. So you get a clash of culture, Jewish culture and Greek culture. And these cities are Corinth, these cities are Ephesus, these cities are Philippi, Pergamum, Antioch, Syria, and Eleusis too. Athens. That's the greater Athens area. Even Athens. Yeah, that's of course. And so think about that. There are millions of Jews being relocated to these Greek cities, and they're bringing their religion with them, but they're also learning Greek religion. And so what you get over a couple of centuries is this sort of gelling together of Jewish and Greek religion and philosophy. And these churches develop. Now think about this. Paul is writing letters in the 40s. Jesus just got crucified in 33. Who is Paul writing to? How did these multiple churches all the way in Greece get started if Jesus just died less than a decade ago? How is there churches in Philippi, Greece, in Corinth, in Asia Minor? Well, that's because there already was as a result of these wars that I was just mentioning and the relocation of Jewish slaves into these regions, you had Greek-speaking Jews developing churches, developing synagogues in all these Greek cities. And so Paul is writing to this established order of churches that already exist prior to Jesus. And he's telling them that about teaching them about Jesus and saying the temple's gone now, or the temple was no more important. We have Jesus. He's the Messiah. Anyways, the point of that was like you had a existing order of Hellenistic Judaism, Greek-speaking Judaism. They're not reading Hebrew scriptures. They're not reading the Hebrew Old Bible. they're reading the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. So they're Septuagint Jews living in Greek cities, inspired by Greek and Hellenism. They speak Greek. They like Greek. They love Plato. They love Aristotle. But they read the Septuagint. They read Isaiah in Greek. They read Genesis in Greek. And so when the Gospels are being written, they're drawing from that Greek flavor of Judaism that's already flourishing all over the Mediterranean. So it wasn't like Christianity took over the Roman Empire. Christianity was already sort of Hellenized Judaism was already sort of established in these urban areas, and it develops into Christianity. There was a group called Hypsisterians, and they are Greeks who don't necessarily read the Old Testament, but they worship one God who they called God Most High. And they have no images in their temples, and they don't worship any other gods. They're monotheist. They're called monist. And they're Platonist. They're philosophical. They're skeptical of paganism. They don't believe in the old gods. They believe in one God, but they're Greeks, and they're not even, and they don't even believe in Judaism. They're just Greek monotheists. Those people are the earliest converts to Christianity besides those Hellenistic Jews. Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzus in the 4th century, they were Hypsisterians before they became Christians. So there's 2 prime examples of people living in Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, which is a completely Greek speaking region before it became Turkish in the 12th or whatever, 11th century, I think it was. Greek area, it's part of Greece basically. And these people were called Hypsisterians. They worship God Most High. And they also developed sort of a Dionysian religion, not in the sense where they're doing orgies and drinking wine, but in the sense that they're being inspired by God through what they call divine mania. And that's like divine revelation. So the idea of being divinely inspired or having divine revelation has roots in the ancient Dionysian religion or the ancient Orphic religion. So yeah, I guess the moral of the story or the reason why I'm telling that story is because the development of Christianity is a slow development that starts long before Jesus even existed. It's a slow cook of Jewish and Hellenistic ideas sort of blending into each other and forming the backdrop for something like the Gospels to come along. Because why even write the Gospels? Who's the audience for the Gospels? You're writing in Greek. Why wouldn't you write in Hebrew? If all this is taking place in Israel, wouldn't you write it in Hebrew? Well, the answer is no, because the people who are the audience for the Gospels are Greek-speaking Jewish people, or even just Greek-speaking Platonists or Pythagoreans living in these urban areas of Pergamon, Alexandria, Egypt, Corinth. And the idea of worshiping one God is sort of a new fad, a new idea that's sort of sweeping the Mediterranean. And so Platonism, Judaism, Pythagoreanism, those are the leading ideas of the day. And Christianity sort of uses those vehicles as its own. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. Yeah, I didn't know hardly any of that, almost none of that, but it's so critical to the formation of Christianity and
it explains it, because people are under the impression that Christianity just came out of nowhere against all odds, persecuted. Everybody was pagan. Everybody was doing orgies and sacrificing goats and basically a bunch of cannibals. And then Christianity comes along and just civilizes everybody. And it was a big miracle, and it conquers the Roman Empire. But it's like, actually, if you look at the history, it makes a lot more sense. It's a slow development. It's not like a conquering thing, but it's the culture itself sort of gears in that direction, because Christianity has a message that is very bottom up. Instead of having, it's very egalitarian, where Jesus preaches like the first will be last and the last will be first, or it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. We all heard this story than it is for a rich man to go to. And it's very much speaking to the people who are plebs. It's speaking to the freed slaves. It's speaking to the people at the bottom, women, children, elderly, people who aren't, well off. It speaks to those people, and the Roman population was mostly people like that. Like it was 90% plebs and 10% equestrian and patrician. So you can see how it dominates the culture, and it becomes very attractive for people who want some sort of salvation. Christianity is the easy outlet for that stuff.
So 2 million slaves, 2 million Jewish slaves at that time period, 300 BC roughly?
Yeah, that's what the major source for that is from an author named Polybius. He's from the Roman era, but he's writing in Greek. So he's writing these vast histories. Polybius is called the Histories. He explains the whole rise of Rome and how Rome ends up becoming the naval dominant power, the dominant naval power of the Mediterranean, when before them it was the Macedonians because of Alexander the Great. So if you think about it like this, the Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin, his story is a 300-year span of time from Aegon the Conqueror, he's the legend, Aegon the Conqueror, all the way to the time of Jon Snow, which is a 300-year period. From the time of Alexander the Great till the time of, or Augustus becomes the first Roman emperor. So when they transitioned from a republic to an empire, that's a 300-year span. And it's almost like a real Game of Thrones story in history, is the time period between Alexander the Great and Augustus. Because you had, in between that 300 years period, you had warring factions of Greek generals fighting over dominance. And
with each other.
With each other. And they're relocating slaves to different cities to work the lands and become the plow workers and the vineyard workers, the jobs that no one wants to do.
It's all Jewish slaves.
The Jews are the ones that were sent to those cities to be to live as the slaves. It's just unfortunate part of history, but it did allow them to spread out into the ancient world, into the Greek cities, and become Hellenized and become a part of the broader Mediterranean world. But another thing that happened during this time period was the idea of people becoming or claiming to be the son of God. So Alexander the Great was the first person, not the first person, but one of the first famous people to be deified and be called, because when he went to Egypt, before he went to Babylon, he went to the Oracle of Ammon in the desert in Siwa. I don't know if you've ever been to Siwa. I was there when I was in Egypt. To the middle of the desert in Egypt. It's very far away. It took a couple hour ride to get there. But Siwa, he went there. He visited the Oracle of Ammon. The priest told him that he's the son of God. So this idea of the son of God starts to develop from Alexander. Demetrius, his name is Demetrius. One of Alexander's generals was a guy named Antigonus the One-Eyed. As he lost one of his eyes in the war. He's called Antigonus the One-Eyed. Antigonus's son was Demetrius, and Demetrius becomes a general in these wars, and he's very famous and he's very, very successful. He loses some major battles. In fact, one of the stories is Ptolemy, the ancestor of Cleopatra, surrounded his whole army. He could have killed him, but he ends up taking him and bringing him into his tent and saying, "I like you, kid. I'm going to let you go. Here's all of your money back. Here's all of your armies back. Go ahead, but just, you lost this war." So he does that. They end up fighting again over the island of Rhodes, and Ptolemy defeats him again at the island of Rhodes. They ended up using his siege ships to build the Colossus of Rhodes. So the famous ancient wonder of the world, which is the giant statue of Helios that everyone's seen pictures of. It was actually used by the metal that they melted down, and they reshaped it to make the Colossus of Rhodes, was because of Demetrius losing this war. But anyways, when Demetrius returned back into Athens and freed them from the from the existing aristocracy, which was the family that removed Alexander's mother and killed her, and killed all of Alexander's. It was Cassander. Cassander was kind of famous as the ancient bad guy, because all of Alexander the Great's descendants were murdered by him, and he became the new leader of the Macedonian world. But Demetrius ends up taking him out of power and removing him from power, and so they thought of him as a liberator, and so he became the second Alexander the Great, basically, and he was the second person in history to unite Greece under what was called the League of Hellas. It only happened twice. Happened with Alexander the Great and his father Philip, and it happened again with this guy Demetrius. So when Demetrius, after he does this, he gets deified by the priests of Eleusis, actually, the Eleusinian mysteries. They deified him, and they called him the Son of God. And he had his own temple and everything. So the idea of somebody becoming the Son of God as they're alive ends up becoming popularized as this. And this is in 280 BC, something like that. So all of a sudden, it becomes like this new idea, whereas somebody can become so great in their lifetime that they become the Son of God just by their deeds. Augustus was called Divi Filii, Son of God in Latin. And there are people who argued that idols are just wood and metal and copper, whereas a human being is actually flesh and blood and can talk and can think. And that made the human being superior to the idol. So you're worshiping an idol statue. It doesn't do anything. It's just metal and wood. Whereas this human being who just passed away did something in their life. There actually were great deeds. We think that this person is superior to that statue. So they thought that people who passed away, who did great deeds, became powerful in the heavens and actually had some sort of power over nature, and you could pray to them. And so that sets up the situation for Jesus to become the Son of God through the messianic way, through the promise of a Messiah. Jesus is also fulfilling not only the messianic human savior, but also the Greek Son of God mentality. So he's doing both, it seems like.
Okay.
Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It's a very complicated thing, but that idea of Son of God is developing throughout many centuries before it gets to Jesus is by no way the first Son of God. Mm-hmm. It happens a lot.
Okay, gotcha.